We are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Mosaab Baba, who is a researcher on Sudan. Mosaab, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you guys for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Well, it's
Big fan of it.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And really, it's great to have you here. Critical story. This week, a lot of things have happened in a way. I mean, we had the anniversary, of course, of the December Revolution on the 19th. We've had the fall of Wad Madani, which, is a major event this week. So maybe just to give a capsule view here of where we are in the conflict, where are we in terms of the humanitarian crisis, as well as the state of the war itself, and then maybe we can get into some of the background as we move through it.
Yeah, sure. Just to give kind of a snapshot of where things are right now, this is possibly the most underreported conflict that's going on right now. Of course, the magnitude of other conflicts, Gaza, and Ukraine and everything are a lot more intense, but this has been kind of brewing for a while, but the effects of it, we have about 6.9 million people displaced right now. And that's basically because this is pretty much almost a complete breakdown of the post-colonial state in Sudan. Since independence, there's been a lot of wars with a lot higher casualties, but over a longer period of time, where we're talking about the war on South Sudan, that was 20 years, about 2 to 3 million people killed. You had Darfur in 2003, it was about 300,000 or so, but over a period of 20 years as well. However, the effects of this war, because this is the first time the war actually happens in Khartoum. Every time, like throughout the past 40 years and even gone before that, all the wars were kind of happening in the periphery. It was the Bashir regime before that, the Nimeri regime, fighting the liberation movements in South Sudan, fighting the liberation movements in the Nuba Mountains, in Darfur, and all of these areas. But this is the first time that the demographic of the center and the north actually see a live hot war, within their vicinity. Myself am from the center of Sudan, from the Khartoum area. So it was like almost people in those regions never saw actual combat. And this it's a very devastating war, because these are basically Bashir's generals going to war. And with, of course, the RSF, which is, made up of what was the Janjaweed, if you remember, during that photo war in the 2000s. And they've basically been expanded, legitimized, and given countless resources. And they have backers like, the UAE, and, their stomping grounds, or the recruiting grounds, actually extend throughout the Sahel. So they extend through Chad and Niger and Mali, and even out to Mauritania. It's that southern Sahara that's been always neglected, extremely impoverished, and it's just very fertile ground for recruitment, militias, militarization, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, like you name it. Like if you take that strip east to west from Sudan all the way out to Mauritania and Mali and these areas, you have a very long strip across Africa that's been just basically a playground. So kind of neo-colonial, resource extraction, militarization, and just chess pieces being moved around to whoever is the highest bidder, whether it's Western countries or Middle Eastern countries. So all of that kind of came to a head on April 15th, where Sudan has become kind of a militia state. Within the past 20 years or so, the professional army started kind of rolling back, and it started relying on these militias to attack people, like I said, in the peripheries. So right now, the amount of displacement, and because of the RSF, they don't rely on like state funds. They actually control a lot of gold mines, and they control a lot of the livestock in Western Sudan, the trade routes, all of these things. And they've been legitimized since like 2013 into its own separate force. So this is something that's kind of been brewing for a while, but it came to its apex right now. And the humanitarian effect is pretty dire, millions that have gone into neighboring countries, internal displacement. And with the fall of Madani recently on, the anniversary of the December 2019 uprising, 19th of December, actually, of the 2018 uprising. But basically, what Madani is not a strategic place that includes a lot of the SAF and a lot of the Bashir ruling party. So it was kind of odd that they would extend into Madani. But it shows kind of a precedence that, at the beginning of the war, people thought, okay, the RSF would want to take down Khartoum and control that border. But now moving into Madani and moving into the east, now they're 2 hours away from Gabarif, which is on the border with Ethiopia. So the extension that they came, from west to Khartoum and then towards the east has kind of, started. Even Sudanese are now saying that this, it's a cliche word that we shouldn't use, but the Somalization, which is basically breaking the country up into separate areas with separate militias controlling these different areas. And when you look at the map, it's kind of crazy. There's some websites like Sudan War Monitor and some of the media that I work with, like Iron Network, that put out, maps and kind of updates on what's going on. And when you look at the map, it's, people say it might be the Libya scenario where you have, two different governments. But in Sudan, it's going to be at least 4 different governments because you still have some of the liberation movements holding territory in places like in the mountains and Darfur. But this is something that nobody has seen in Sudan, in the whole region. And that's why you see a lot of anxiety from the entire region on what's going on in Sudan, in fears of it kind of spreading over the borders. It's kind of hard to, of course, encapsulate all that in a couple of minutes. But that's kind of the situation right now. And the negotiations first started in Jeddah, of course. U.S., Saudi kind of supported negotiations to try and bring the RSF and SAF together. But it seems at this point that kind of all leverage is gone. Maybe the UAE still has leverage with the RSF. Egypt probably has some leverage with SAF. But both of the belligerents are not, they're self-funded. So they bankroll their operations from local resources in Sudan. So it's almost like, they can survive without having a bankroll coming from outside. But it really is kind of a neo-colonial, setup. And it just so happens, it's no coincidence that, the countries that are supporting both the RSF and SAF are countries that have normalized with Israel. You know what I mean? Even Burhan and Hemeti, as recent as May, have met with the Israeli foreign minister, and they were talking about normalization. Not because they're crazy about normalization, but it's because the countries that support them were the ones that were leading the normalization. Even if you notice in the UN General Assembly, Netanyahu put up a map of the new Middle East, basically saying if, it's just Saudi Arabia that's holding out, if they normalize, then this will be the map of the new Middle East. And unfortunately, Sudan was in that map, and because of those normalization efforts. So it's almost like, when an empire falls, it's pretty much, the outskirts of the empire that start crumbling first. And unfortunately, we've been in the outskirts of the empire for about 40 years right now, since the neoliberal project launched. Sudan was one of the first countries that were in the region that were squarely going along with U.S. policy, with, Reagan at the time, even their ideologues like Turabi. He went to the White House and met with Reagan, Bush. So it was kind of like that was the dawn of what we're seeing right now. It's kind of the blame of that post-colonials.
You mentioned the words like neocolonialism. You mentioned some other countries involved in various ways. You mentioned Israel, U.S., Saudi. I'm just curious, oftentimes when these types of conflicts are reported in the mainstream media, it's, often, civil war, very organic. And I'm not denying there's anything organic here, but I'm just curious, are there any outside foreign powers that are benefiting from this escalation or participating in fueling it?
So it seems from our reporting and our investigations that the benefit was kind of more before the war. If you're the UAE and you're supporting something like the RSF, you want some level of stability to be able to siphon out the gold, the livestock, start trying to make deals, set up a port on the Red Sea and stuff like that. So even these countries, they need some level of, stability in order to kind of do business with with both of these belligerents. And right now, it kind of seems that the plot has been lost. So it's been kind of a neocolonial state where it's more, if you want to like draw a diagram, it would be basically, SAF, its strongest supporter was Sisi's military government, and the RSF's main supporter was the UAE. And Saudi was kind of Saudi Arabia had relationships with both of them because both of them were recruited to fight the Yemen war. During the Yemen war, like ever since 2014, young men in Sudan, they would get offers like, hey, if you go and fight in Yemen for 6 months, you get $30,000. That's a lot of money for an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old in Sudan. But of course, it was like, the Saudis and the UAE, they're not going to fight their wars on the ground. So where's the best recruiting ground? It's the country that's militarized entire societies. It's militarized entire tribes, entire regions. So the security sector has kind of been that ghost that's been hovering. But these countries have made a lot of money out of Sudan. If you go to the statistics, like when it comes to land grabs in Africa, Sudan is number 1 and South Sudan is number 2. So, and that's pretty much what 40 years of, Bashir was was kind of flipping back and forth. He was first, very tight with Iran and with Russia and everything. Then 2014, he just flipped into the Gulf states and started trying to normalize with the West and stuff like that. So there's not a long track record, but it's like a 10-year track record of these countries actually, pretty much controlling both of these forces, and this is basically, after the fall of Bashir and everything, it was kind of a free-for-all. So, a lot of trips between Abu Dhabi and Khartoum, between Cairo and Khartoum. So, yeah, it was very, even Sudanese, when they start looking at their situation during the uprising, like, we really do not control our own destiny. We don't control our security sector. We don't control the biggest economic sectors in the country. We don't control foreign relations. So what exactly is a civilian government if it doesn't control any of these aspects?
Mosaab, let me ask you this too as well. In the last couple of minutes we have here, I mean, obviously, I think many people prior to the war breaking out had seen the huge demonstrations, millions of people taking to the streets. I mean, where do some of the popular movements that were behind that stand, at this stage of the game?
So you had kind of a mix. Some of the resistance committees were saying, the SAF, the National Army, they're controlled a lot by like the NCP, which is kind of the Sudanese version of the Muslim Brotherhood. So we shouldn't really support them. But at the same time, we don't want the RSF to take over the entire country. I mean, the RSF is a militia through and through with an ethno kind of, ideology of like, Arab supremacy and stuff like that. So they're like, we definitely don't want them. So we're kind of forced to support the National Army. But the majority of the resistance committees are saying, hey, we went out to the streets against both of these factions. All of these factions were all part of the Bashir regime, and we wanted all of them gone. So we're not going to stand with either one of them. They have to negotiate a settlement and then hand over power to civilians, which is theoretically easy to say, but once it comes down to a applying that, it's a lot more difficult. But that's kind of how the stance is split between kind of the revolutionaries who were out in the streets, who went for like years out in the streets and, demanding for their rights. And it was really kind of a homegrown, movement. So kind of see that shattered. A lot of this is kind of also kind of punishing that, movement that was calling for a complete overhaul of the country and a complete restructuring of the security sector, and justice, for all the people who've been dying throughout the past 40 years.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us here on the show and helping us sort through all this. We'll definitely bring you back in the new year because there's a lot to cover and a lot to keep covering. Mosaab Baba, a researcher on Sudan, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you, Eugene. Thanks, Rania.